Okay.
Saturday, Rutgers at noon, hosting Wisconsin at SHI Stadium in Piscataway. Rutgers 4-1, 1-1 in the Big Ten. Welcomes the Badgers 3-2, 1-1, coming off a 52-6 win over Purdue. Rutgers obviously coming off that disappointing loss to Nebraska. David Anderson's back to help preview the action in what is a critical week for both programs. And I think just in terms of Rutgers, obviously wanting to get back on the winning track after a game that really was there for the taking. I belabored that point this week in my coverage, and happy to have David here. Let's start with your initial thoughts on Wisconsin. They've had a lot of injuries. They've obviously replaced Tyler Van Dyke at quarterback, out for the year. Ches Malusi, their number one back, is now gone from injuries as well. Overall thoughts on this Phil Longo-led offense for the Badgers?
So again, yeah, to your point, I think that there's a lot of angst for Tyler Van Dyke, who I think was unfairly, he clearly won the job, and then he just was not delivering what they, I guess, had hoped. So now it's in the hands of Braden Locke anyway. So fans kind of got what they deserved on that in a sense. And then also Ches Malusi on not playing anymore. I'm not sure if he's going to end up elsewhere next year. Seemed like, from my perspective, he was given a lot of the tough assignments especially against USC, especially in that game against Alabama. And he was really the only back that was making anything against Alabama. But because of they've got some younger guys who bring some things to the table, fans were kind of wanting more of the other guys, and sounds like the coaching staff as well. So with Malusi just also banged up, seemed like there was a little bit of a disconnect there, because also these younger guys, especially their freshmen, which we'll get to in a second, they do offer promise. They were brought in by this coaching staff specifically for this offense long term. And so I think that there's a little bit of, let's say, overemphasis on the skills of some of their backs. And so similar thing for their wide receiver room, where there's a lot of guys, and we might see a similar situation to Washington where there's just so many guys. In that case, it was more on their defense, that their coaches they can't get anybody going because there's too many guys battling for reps. And so I think ultimately they do want to get the younger guys more carries because they are looking past this season. Their schedule is brutal. So I can understand why Malusi, who would have been in his final season had he not only played 4 games, that they're looking towards the future. Because I've even heard on one Wisconsin podcast where someone was like, they might not win another game. That's how tough their schedule is. And so I think that's where it's going to be dependent on their coaching staff to not overthink it, get a couple guys prepared, and go from there. Who those guys are, I'll take my best guess. But there's a lot of different guys you might see depending on what their coaching staff elects to do.
Yeah, and in talking to Wisconsin, I had Kedrick Stumbris on, writes for Athlon Sports for Wisconsin, and does the Scon A6 podcast, and he was saying that Malusi really was kind of hindered by his injuries and wasn't as effective as he typically was prior to last year's season-ending injury, and that was a factor also. So from a production standpoint, I think Wisconsin feels like they're actually in better shape now, and that Luke Fickell talked this week about the rotation and wanting to, have it a little bit tighter in terms of getting a better flow on offense. In terms of quarterback, in replacing Van Dyke, Brandon Locke, he does have some experience from last year also. He hasn't been super efficient so far. Did throw 2 interceptions against Purdue, which is clearly, I think, the worst team in the Big Ten. Also talked to Kedrick about Wisconsin's fumbled it 10 times this year so far. They've lost 5 of them. But how important do you think, I guess, from a game plan perspective, is that just something you preach in general? Is there anything you think that Rutgers will do to try to mix looks up and confuse Luck? Or do you think it'd be more similar to the approach against Washington, where it was more designed pressure to move the ball in certain spots of the field?
I think that since the Washington game plan was so successful in what it was, I do expect we might go back to that. Because when you're working with a lot of younger players, and we'll talk about this more, especially when we get to, I think we're going to do a midseason like recap. More guys have played on defense than we expected already. So there have been a lot of young guys that have gotten some reps. And so when the longer they have to cover, the more trouble they will be in. The more that there's uncertainty around where a ball might go, the harder it is for them. So if you can kind of force the ball, like we were talking about against Washington, if you can force the ball into a certain area or say, there's a pretty high likelihood it's going to go there. And I do think Braden Locke, he makes pretty good reads. His limitations are more his arm strength. I mean, he will throw deep, but sometimes it's a 50-50 ball and he's just hoping his receiver out-toughs the defender. And sometimes it's because the guy's pretty wide open because he made a good read. But you should not particularly be scared that he's going to be like firing balls into tight windows like Dylan Raiola could, which Rutgers did do a great job of defending last week regardless. So against a quarterback with less arm strength, I think that they should have a even better success in that facet of the game. So one other thing I would say, kind of big picture, is like I talked about early in the season. I think one of the challenges is the first time you face like a good team overall, and so that's why I think that sometimes you look at that. Rutgers had an advantage early last year because they played Northwestern in the season opener, which was another Big Ten team. I think now we're starting to see that almost at a micro level as well. And so the fact that Rutgers faced two talented quarterbacks the last 2 weeks, really three if you go back to Virginia Tech.
Yeah.
Braden Locke does not scare you. He's not like a step up from those guys. So you should have a pretty good idea of how your defensive back should be able to handle a quarterback like him. And when you factor in that, I think you can dictate to him where he's going to go with the ball based on where you bring pressure from. This should simplify what your defense has to do and allow them to read and react. So I think to answer your question, yes, I think we'll see more of the Washington game plan than we saw of the Nebraska game plan. But what they need to figure out is how do they maintain the pressure up front that they got against Nebraska that we hadn't seen up until that point. I mean, the biggest takeaway from that game in a positive way was that the Rutgers defensive line stepped up.
Yeah, absolutely. The defense certainly came together. I think part of that too is, some of the key guys are getting either shaking the rust off or getting a little bit healthier as well. Even Troy Rainey got, a decent amount of snaps in that game. Their depth along the defensive lines improving. They, as you mentioned, some of the younger guys are getting more reps now, and I think improving as well. And in terms of Wisconsin, just going back to Locke, Kedrick mentioned that the Wisconsin staff talked about he made 17 adjustments, 17 different play call adjustments at the line last week, and they assessed that 16 were for a positive. So to your point, he is really good at making reads. He's really good at making adjustments at the line. So I'm curious to see how much they will send pressure, design pressure off the blitz, or disguise certain looks, along with kind of what you're saying with the Washington game plan and how they approach things. But who are some of the playmakers on offense that concern you from a Rutgers perspective?
So I guess there's two guys that their general podcast base, and again, kudos to Wisconsin. This is another great week because there's like 3 or 4 that you get almost daily content, maybe 6 that get multiple podcasts per week out, and so they really want to get their hands on Dupree, who was their number 3 running back. Now he's their number 2. They talk about getting the ball in his hands. He doesn't really have great numbers. I don't know if his vision's that great. He's only averaging 3.7 yards a carry, but he does have that physical burst. And so that's why he's one of the ones. And then the other one is Tretch, the wide receiver. I thought that was like a nickname, but I'm pretty sure that's just his actual name is
Tretch
Kahuna. He's a Hawaiian guy, I believe. And so let's start with the running back. So those are the two that people want to see get the ball more. In the running back room, they have Walker, who's now taken over as their lead back. I think he's solid. I think he reminds me a lot of the Nebraska running backs, and he's not going to kill you because he's too big, but he's big, he's fast. His vision's He'll break some tackles. He will fight for yardage. And like we saw from Nebraska last week, which I had said in the pregame, and I will give myself kudos for one thing, there's only one running back in that Nebraska room that had really good vision. And I think it was number 14, Johnson. There's 2 Johnsons, right? And he's the only one who really broke a big play. I think one in the run game and one in the receiving game. He had that play that set up the touchdown for Nebraska on like a short pass. But I feel like Wisconsin's kind of in a similar boat. Dupree, then they also have Dylan Jones. So Dupree and Dylan Jones are both true freshmen. People like what they've seen from him. And then the other guy who's kind of a fan favorite is Yakimelli. So he is a guy, Cade Yakimelli, who's averaging 7 yards a carry. This is not a Coleman from Washington 7 yards a carry. He's their number 3 running back, comes against a depleted defense, and he will take the ball and run hard. And if you don't want to tackle him, he'll just keep running. But if you have a bigger, stronger guy like a Tyreen Powell, he can take him down. I don't say every time because I don't want to jinx it, as I'm knocking on wood. But the reason Yakimelli doesn't get more time is because he's not an elite physical athlete. Like, he's pretty big, and he'll just take the ball and run forward. He's not trying to do anything too complicated. And so they kind of have a lot of guys in the running back room. I mean, who would I be scared of most if I was defensive coordinator Joe Harrison-Miak? Maybe Dupree, I guess. I think that's a fair thing to say. But if you lighten up against any of them, then they're going to make your day hard. And there was times in the USC game where they just didn't want to tackle these guys, whereas Alabama was willing to accept the challenge and just, hitting them hard. And then in the receiving game, I talked about Tretch because he's their backup slot man. Their starting slot man is Will Pauling, who's a good receiver. We saw him play pretty well against Rutgers last year. And so I think they're going to be things that Phil Longo, offensive coordinator, New Jersey native for Wisconsin, is going to try to do to get his 2 slot receivers both on the field. I'm not sure what he's going to do for that, but really that's their most dangerous situation right now, is when both those guys can be in the game. And then also Vinny Anthony, I thought had the best game 2 weeks ago. He's fast, his hands are okay, and he just seems like a gamer. So he made some nice plays the last couple of weeks. He's probably past Bryson Green as their best receiver, most dangerous receiver, I would say. And so the reason I'm not as concerned about him when you first asked me the question is Barney from Nebraska, who they were hyping up as like their speed, like electric guy. Rutgers contained him completely last week. He didn't beat them at all. So what scares me a little bit more is those guys who are going to be running a lot of deep routes. And Vinny Anthony is a guy that, him or Tretch, if you let them catch the ball and you don't tackle them right away, they're going to get some yards after catch. And because Locke lacks arm strength, you cannot let that happen. If they catch the ball, let them catch the ball, tackle them, move on to the next down. But Locke isn't going to beat you with bombs or tight window throws. So you got to just make sure you force him to matriculate the ball down the field on a long drive. And the guys who potentially could beat you with that the most are Tretch, Dupree, and maybe Vinny Anthony. So again, the last comment on their wide receiver room is that I think that they're a little overly optimistic about their receivers, kind of like Rutgers fans were heading into the season. We're like, oh, we got all these receivers, we're going to be so good. And then we have a game where only 2 of them even catch a pass against Virginia Tech, right? So I think that optimism is a little bit because they have been devoid of a lot of good receivers for a long time. And so their expectations are a little bit off, but that's not to say we didn't see a very deep stable of receivers last year contribute to a win against Rutgers, and to say that they don't have a lot of guys on the team now who could beat you if you're not careful.
Yeah, great points there. And going back to Pauling, their number 1 receiver, he did miss the second half against Purdue.
Yeah.
He had a leg injury. He is practicing this week, but him not playing in that second half opened up the opportunity for Kekahuna, who had 6 catches, 134 yards, and 2 touchdowns. So it was actually named Freshman of the Week in the Big Ten. So it should be interesting there. Like you mentioned, lots of targets, but the secondary, obviously limiting those yards after catch. Rutgers did a much better job against Nebraska in regard to
Great
tackling.
job.
That was huge comparatively to the Washington game. So I think that obviously is another key in this game, to your point, that Locke is not going to, throw the ball 50 yards a play. And I think it's really going to be interesting just in terms of time of possession in this game, and also just controlling the clock.
The Wisconsin offensive line I talked about last year, I thought that their splits were a little off. Their communication was a little off. Way better this year. So the second year in the same offense, I think they actually have AJ Blasick as their offensive line, one of their offensive line coaches now, who had coached at Rutgers. And when you look back at it, AJ Blasick should have probably got more credit for how well the Rutgers offensive line played in that 2017 season. And then things just really dropped off once they let him go. So I think that he's probably partially to respect for that. But I also think that Wisconsin offensive line, they are vulnerable if you rush from the outsides. So they don't have that lateral mobility, just like you would expect from a Wisconsin offensive line. So they're kind of forced to keep a tight end into block. But if they go max protection, they've been more than ample at holding up. Or if you only rush 3, their communication's been good enough that, like, hey, I'm getting slightly beat, but the guy to my left or my right can help me out with that block. And so you're not going to get away with rushing 3. I can promise you that. You've either got to rush 4 or blitz, even if it's a delayed blitz, but you've got to pressure them and you've got to make it tough. And then the other thing I'll say about it is sometimes Braden Locke will rush the throw, even if he's not actually under pressure, but just because he perceives that there might be pressure. So if he thinks there's someone down at his feet swiping at his ankles, that's why he made one of his turnovers last week. Or if he just feels like his offensive line is kind of falling into him, he'll get rid of the ball rather than taking the sack. So sometimes on the defensive line, it's equally about just pushing your guy a little bit, staying engaged, and then getting your hand up to try to alter those windows of those throws, because he has had a lot of passes knocked down at the line. And so if the Rutgers defensive lineman, you got to be giving 110%. If you don't, you're going to be easily blocked. But if you do, you might get a tip ball. You might force them into a bad play, all those things. And so this isn't the Wisconsin line of yesteryear, but their vulnerabilities are still the same as they were in the past when they would try to go to the air.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the offensive line. Actually, Jack Nelson, their left tackle, had the highest grade of any Big Ten lineman from Pro Football Focus in Week 6. And overall, they've been pretty solid this year. Like you said, they're not vintage Wisconsin offensive line, but they've held up pretty well. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the defensive line for Rutgers can generate pressure. Is Bailey working his way back? He played about 30 snaps against Nebraska. As you mentioned before the Nebraska game, and we saw in the Nebraska game, Aaron Lewis has been very, very good. Keontae Hamilton has really stepped up at the last 2 games and really shown out. So that's encouraging. But that's going to be a big key for sure. Let's shift to the other side of the field with the Wisconsin defense going against the Rutgers offense. Any initial thoughts on the Wisconsin defense coming into this matchup?
So the first thing to know is they really play a 2-4-5, basically. So there's only really 2 down linemen, and so you got to just take advantage of that. I mean, no matter how smart you scheme up a defense, you have to offensively punish them for doing that. Just punish them. So if they're only going to have 2 guys in there who are, above, let's say 280, 290, like, you got to just pound the rock, force them to put extra people in the box. Same thing we talked about last year, and I feel like you could just cut and paste a lot of what we talked about in the preview last year, is that there's a lot of straight line speed on this Wisconsin defense. So if their linebackers in this 2-4-5 are basically playing defensive end all the time, in a sense, right? If you want to think about it from that standpoint. So there's a lot of straight line speed. And basically what USC did was, if they saw guys coming in hard, they would just either call screens or just wait for the guys to come in and just dump it over the top to a running back. It was kind of odd. It was like a check down, but a designed play check down that was not a screen. Like, there was a lot of ways to kind of take advantage of that. So I do think their linebackers are pretty good in the sense of they're smarter and better than Virginia Tech's. Same thing as last year. They may not be as physically fast and mobile, but they're smart players. They'll generally be in position. But if you pound the rock, there's only at most 6 guys that are in the front box area, unless they bring Wooler, their safety, down. So you cannot get too cute. You can't overthink this. You have to just pound the ball, get those body blows in, and even if you're not having insane early success, they will wear it down. I guarantee it. That's just the nature of the defense that they run. So that's what I would say about the front. They actually have a defensive lineman, Hills, who's actually from New Jersey. I think he played at Del Barton. He has 2 sacks. He had one of the key pressures against USC. So there's a guy who, I think he played at Albany, if I'm remembering right. So clearly not a guy who came out of high school and was playing, like Power 4 football, but, has grown into later in his career a guy who can bring a little bit of pressure. But other than that, like, you should be able to block these guys. The only concern I have is, I mean, Gus Zielinskis really struggled when he had a man head up on him. So when I say that, I mean the defensive tackle in defensive line terms is in a zero tech, which means like he's just head up on the center, which makes it tough if you're a center because you got to snap the ball and then immediately block the guy, which really can be difficult. And Nebraska's interior really forced Rutgers to not be able to run up the gut, which is, I think, why they abandoned it so early, even though Monunga had run for, I think it was 64 yards in the first quarter. But but one of the reasons it was so successful on the defensive line for Nebraska was because Rutgers didn't deliver those body blows. You got to just keep hitting them there. And expect this is going to be a four-quarter game. And then Tyler Needham, I think he'll bounce back. But Wisconsin, because these line guys that he's going to be blocking are more linebackers, and he does generally have mobility. I think he struggles with the bigger, like, power guys that he won't be facing this week. So hopefully a bounce-back game for Tyler Needham. But it's also possible we'll see a shakeup on the Rutgers offensive line because it wasn't necessarily Taj White at left guard. I don't want to blame him entirely, but his in the lineup did have ripple effects throughout the team. And so they're going to have to either do something or be ready with a quick hook if things are not working again like they were last week.
Yeah, I agree with you. I chalked it up more as almost like a rhythm thing. They were just thrown off. I mean, they had 3 false starts. I don't even think they had. I can't remember how many they had in the first 4 games, but it wasn't even 3, if they even had one. And so I just thought they were just out of sorts in a multitude of ways, and no one really had a very good game. They weren't able. I mean, that goal line opportunity epitomized their inability to get any push. In terms of against that Nebraska front 4. But yeah, Wisconsin, is definitely a different type of formation. They're not nearly as big up front. This is seems on paper like a good bounce back week. And I guess transitioning to the Rutgers game plan, and we can still lace in things on the Wisconsin defense if you want. But that is what I think a lot of fans are wondering is, the kind of different game plan approach that they used against Nebraska. And this feels like a classic matchup where Rutgers just wants to, be able to establish a lead, control the clock, really run at Wisconsin and wear them down. And they have the personnel and I think the capabilities of doing so based on Wisconsin's defense and their framework. In terms of Calais Kmanis, obviously needs to bounce back. Just thoughts on what he needs to do and what you think Rutgers might do to kind of get him back on track in this game.
I mean, a lot comes down to his mobility. I think there's a lot of reasons that Rutgers went into last week's game and the game took on a personality, as Gianna would say, that they were not expecting, or it was too many variables to be sure. And it seemed like they weren't going play action because maybe they didn't want him to have to move laterally, which is kind of important. I mean, He was playing with a knee brace. Don't know when that happened, but his mobility wasn't as bad as they were kind of acting. He was able to move more than I thought he would, even being limited in that regard. The other thing I would say is, and another thing that I've heard people say, and I don't know the stats in this in college, but they say you can't abandon play. If you can't run the ball, you should stop doing play action. Well, first of all, Rutgers could run the ball. And second, every study that's been done in the NFL, which is a lot more extensive than college, says that even if you're not running the ball successfully, play action still works. And so I think that for sure they need to go back to that because you got to freeze those linebackers, again, who have a lot of responsibilities in this Wisconsin defense. They got to pass rush, they got to cover, they got to make tackles. And so you've got to isolate them like we talked about the Nebraska middle linebacker last week. And you've got to try to dictate to them where you're going with the ball, not just let them play back and react. And so I think play action is a good way to do that. The other thing that I think you can do, like I talked about, since they have a lot of straight line speed, the Fletcher RPO that got stopped at the goal line against Nebraska but was so successful against Virginia Tech, that play might work. But what will probably work better is if Fletcher is literally blocking guy first, then uses his speed to disengage. Because I have more confidence in Kenny Fletcher's acceleration as a tight end than I do that a Wisconsin linebacker who may be engaged with him has to realize last minute, hey, I got to completely turn around my body and run a 180 here. So I would be trying to utilize that a lot if I could from Fletcher. The other thing is just, Tyler Needham is going to be facing, even if there's a guy in front of him, he might be standing up and he might not be in a down position. So that should give you a leverage point to run like straight behind your tackle type runs. And so attack that area. So what will happen subsequently, Wisconsin's going to have to bring guys down into the box to handle it. And then what do you go from there? This is where I think Demir Miller, again, is an X factor because he's got the quickness. He's going to be quicker than everyone on the Wisconsin defense except for maybe Hallman. So if you can get him basically against anybody, he should be able to get a step if you can deliver that ball. And I think Calic Manis like a little bit of a bad rap last week because he was under constant pressure. He was pressured, 19 times? It was basically 50% of his dropbacks. And so you have to be ready for the quick game, and it's easier to have a quick game if guys are in the box. So, that to say, I think Wisconsin's defensive backs are smart, but other than Hallman, none of them are super elite athletes, and they were getting exposed against USC for that reason. Wohler, again, probably their best guy in their secondary, most famous for hitting Gavin Wimsatt from behind in the head on a late hit, not being ejected. And then he did it again 2 weeks ago, and I was so mad when I saw it because I don't know if it was the quarterback for USC, but it was a late hit all the way. Guy was sliding. Wohler comes in, pops him in the head. Doesn't get ejected again. 15-yard penalty, but to his credit, Wohler on the next play made an interception. Now, maybe it's because the guy was rattled from getting popped in the head on the previous play, but I respect him as a player in terms of his skills. He can cover, but again, he's not an elite athlete. Like if you can get Ian Strong in these matchups, he should win those balls. If you can get, Ben Black running deep down the sideline, like he should be able to get open. So really the question for me in the game plan, last thing before I pass it back over to you, is Ben Black, if you can force them to have to put Hallman guarding him because no one else can cover his deep speed, that opens everything else up. Mm-hmm. If their other guys are getting by covering Ben Black, then that allows them to do a lot more with Hallman and Wohler in their secondary. And so that's kind of where if you're Kirk Ciarrocca, you got to attack behind the tackle runs, and then offensively on the outsides, you got to force them to cover you deep down the sidelines. Because even in his compromised state, Calic Manis threw 2 dimes to Ben Black, one earlier in the drive, and then the one that ultimately hit him in the helmet. But then, and then again, Black got open because they had to respect it on the touchdown. I know that the ball was tipped, but he was open. The throw was it was a great play there by the defender to tap the ball. But I do think Ben Black has to be a part of your offense going forward because of what he's potentially capable of doing, even if he hasn't proved it game in and game out yet.
Yeah, great points. It's a good transition to wide receiver because I wanted to talk about Demir Miller, Ian Strong, and Black. But I think also now that we're, a few days removed from the Nebraska game, I really do think there is a positive in how Calic Manis battled in that game and how he made his best throws at the end of that game through everything he had been through. I just think from a character perspective, from a toughness perspective, from a leadership perspective, he's got the respect of that huddle. And I think that's crucial coming off of a disappointing, poor performance, is that they're not going to waver as a team, as an offense, and they just have to kind of get back out there. And I think this defense that they're facing is ideal in terms of them being able to utilize their strengths. That being said, they do need to have some type of passing attack. I mentioned it in my recap or at one point this week, but Demir Miller, he's kind of been pedestrian in terms of his stats. I don't think a part of it, I don't think it's all his fault. I don't think he's been prioritized enough. I don't think they've utilized his versatility enough, but this feels like a matchup where they can really get him out in open space. And also in terms of being strong, I think that's a big question mark in this matchup. He obviously was hampered against Nebraska. I thought he was a key in that Nebraska game and could take advantage of some matchups. So what they're able to get out of him remains to be seen in this game. But I think you're right in terms of Black's big playability and Demir Miller's versatility. I think they really have to make him a focal point in the pass game.
Yeah, I think that kind of like we're talking about how Washington had so many guys on defense, some of which are banged up, and they didn't really know what they should do best. And similar to what we're talking about with Wisconsin on their offense, embarrassment of riches, not the right term, but just a lot of guys you can go to that can make plays. I think when you look back at Rutgers' offensive game plan last week, it's really hard to game plan if you're not sure on the status of certain players.
Yeah.
Because if you know flat out all week Ian Strong not playing, then you plan accordingly. But if he might play, or then he plays, he makes a catch, and then you're like, all right, maybe we can play him. And so I think sometimes that makes it a little tougher for the offensive staff in that situation. So that's one of them. And then, KJ Duff was doing okay. Again, this is a game where I think Duff or Strong might be able to make, again, an impact because the Wisconsin defensive backs are not big. And the guys who are big, they are forced to play closer to the box because they play with such a light box in general. So you're going to be facing guys who are more like cornerback size a lot of times. So Duff and Strong could be an X factor as well as Miller. And so, again, I think there's a lot of ways you could go with this, but hopefully Rutgers can go in with a game plan, or at least if you weren't sure if Ian Strong was 100%, you feel confident, hopefully, that KJ Duff can run the same plays just in his place. Mm-hmm. One of the things I talked about preseason was I wasn't sure if Ian Strong was going to be the red zone guy because maybe someone else can kind of take that red zone role and you can expand Strong in another way. Hopefully they call plays that if Ian Strong's in the game, he can do it. But if Duff's in the game, he knows the playbook. He can make the plays as well. Obviously, he's not been around as long, so you wouldn't expect him to know his playbook and have his routes as tight, for example. But that's where, I think it's an X factor. But I think the coaching staff just struggled last week in their preparation because they weren't sure how mobile Kyle McManus was. They weren't sure how good they were going to be able to run the ball. They weren't sure how healthy these guys were at wide receiver. And ultimately, too many variables made it really hard to game plan, and they generally overthought it and guessed wrong a lot of times. But I do think this should be a bounce back game for Shiraka. We've seen for the most part he's had a generally good season, and Wisconsin is clearly a team that has very specific weaknesses that you can't overthink. You've got to just attack.
Yeah, excellent analysis there. And wanted to ask, just in terms of this season, in terms of if Rutgers does want to be able to win 9-10 games, you have to win this game on Saturday. Yeah. For sure. And you've never beaten Wisconsin. You're at home, a part of a 2-game homestand. This is as vulnerable as Wisconsin's ever been that they've faced them. There's never been a better opportunity to beat them. I think their strengths match up with their weaknesses. How important is it for you in this game? I just think would really dramatically lower the ceiling for the season. I know the players and the coaches can't think that way, but from your perspective, how big of a game is this?
This is turning into one of those forks in the season type games. I didn't feel that way last week. I felt like last week, if they could have won, it would be great. Now, to your kind of point from your recap, it hurts more when you're there, when you're right there. And you're like, if we just could do what we did on offense for the rest of the season, even close to that, you probably come out of that game with the win. I say probably because you can't just say for sure it would have been a win. Nebraska would probably have altered their game plan on offense, right. Especially though another thing we talked about in the preview last week was Nebraska didn't really change their game plan when they had the lead. They still just threw the same way. Like with Raiola, they didn't have to rely on certain bombs to make big plays. In the run game, they kind of ran the same stuff. Rutgers just outplayed them in that second half, especially the Rutgers defense. So, yeah, but that's why it hurts so much because you say to yourself, there's so many of these games and they're kind of like a coin flip. Once it turns up, you move on to the next flip and it's pretty much independent of the previous, right? Sure. And that's how these toss-up games are. Like, no one even cares anymore that Rutgers beat Virginia Tech last second. Like, it doesn't really matter as much. We're so far past that at this point. So when you have these toss-up games, you have to try to win them. And then that goes, again, towards recruiting and the general vibe around the program, energy within the locker room, things like that. So, I think before I get to just wrap that thought, we have to talk about special teams really quick because Nebraska's vulnerability was their coverage. Rutgers only tried to return one punt, and I do think Dremel made a decent job. And I will bring up, I thought it was very questionable to not go all out punt block when he was in the back of his end zone when you had already blocked 2. Now, I understand if you hadn't blocked 2, that is a good time to go punt return because you get 2 guys blocking. Dremel returned it easily to like the 30-yard line. So you should score from there, at least a field goal, right? Yep. But I do think that I almost think that deflated the team a little bit that they didn't go for the block because what made Rutgers in that game from the very beginning was any kick could have been blocked. So if you just stop Nebraska and force a punt, you might get the punt block and return it for a touchdown. At any point that could have happened. And so that's one of the reasons where sometimes you got to stick to your identity. Rutgers didn't do that on special teams at the end, and they didn't do that with Kyle Monunga either. And this week, they have to make sure they do that. Now, back to special teams. Wisconsin has had their own team has muffed 3 punts, and the other teams have muffed 4. I believe it's 4. And all of their games have been impacted by these plays, good or bad. And so one of the reasons is because they've been playing all noon games local time. And so sun seems to have been a factor. Like you saw the Purdue return or even the USC guys kind of like staring up and like not being able to see. And so and the Wisconsin guys too. So I think it's like both teams were affected by this. And this is a noon kick again. So they just keep having this problem. But their punter kicks kind of a knuckleball, and he kicks a lot of different types of kicks. So he made one kick against USC that he just basically kicked a line drive, and it rolled all the way to like the 2-yard line. And so then on the subsequent kick, because USC was gun shy and they didn't want it to do that, the returner tried to return one that was not a line drive, and he ended up fumbling the ball, setting up Wisconsin for a touchdown. And so their punter is a weapon. We can't lose sight of that. But it's really dependent on the return of this game to catch the ball or at least make the right decision about letting it go, because you cannot muff a punt. You cannot muff a punt against these guys. And so that is a big factor. Otherwise, on special teams, I also want to make my Jay Patel comment, and Larry Kay made a good comment about this in his preview with Wisconsin. Jay Patel has been unfairly blamed in this season. Absolutely. And the reason is because, first of all, like I said, that kick against Virginia Tech from the right hash, I think that's the toughest kick for a kicker in college. In the NFL, the hashes are more in the middle. So a kick from the right side, especially close up, is just not natural. I use the soccer example. If you're on the right side of the 18-yard box, you're going to be aiming opposite corner just because it's an awkward kind of position if you're a right-footed kicker. And then kicking 2 long ones, they've done him no favors. The only one maybe you could blame is the block against Washington, I guess. I'm not sure how much was his fault. But this game is one of those games where you have to take the points if you can get those early. Rutgers, again, if we talk about overcoaching last week, they thought that game was going to be 28-24, 28-21, and it turned out to be 14-7. Leaving those points potentially on the table early on was a complete fail. But again, I understand why they did it. I do think it was the wrong choice. But the logic behind it, at least there was logic behind it, to go for that fake field goal. Last thing I'll say about that, people have talked about defense should know if Timmy Ward comes out there, he's not the normal holder. But that would be more effective on the first kick of the game which is why Rutgers did it that way. Because if it's the first kick of the game, like we saw against NC State in the bowl game with Rob Cervini, like that works on the first play. But if Anderson had been holding all game and then you take him out, it's not going to work. So I get why they came into that game saying, okay, if we get a less than 4th and 5 on our first field goal attempt, we're going to fake it. But it turned out that he ran into 4 people. Like the play was going nowhere. But I can see why Rutgers just did a little bit of overcoaching logic there. But this week you got to just be solid on special teams. You don't need to rely on your special teams to win this game, but you can't let your special teams lose this game. And so I think Wisconsin special teams is kind of up and down. Rutgers should have the advantage, but we'll see. Any other thoughts on special teams? I know I just dove into a lot of different aspects of it.
All great points. I think going back to that, not going for the block after they got the second block in that game and they set it for coverage instead. It's like with Nebraska punting out of their own end zone, your best chance of scoring is actually blocking the kick for a team that has had no returns in the punt game all year. And I think that philosophy just has to be inbred in them. moving forward. Like you said, in this game, special teams has to be solid, but I think they have to continue to just go all out for that pump block because they're just so good at it. And it can really just change the dynamic of the game. And that was a big difference. And, if Loyal can just get 2 more yards in and it's no lack of effort on his end, that changed the whole dynamic of the game. And we saw last year 3 blocks, 3 scores. They won all 3 of those games. In terms of Patel, you definitely, I also talked about just in terms of his psyche and their how they need to get him confidence. Can they just get him a couple 25 to 35 or 25 to 40 yard attempts? And if you think back now, the last 3 games, he's had a field goal attempt in that range that has not worked out. He missed the 36-yarder against Virginia Tech. The Washington one was blocked. Obviously, they had the fortuitous penalty that led to a touchdown. And then you had the opportunity early in that game, and they took it away from him with the fake. That was my biggest thing, was that you took an opportunity away from him to build confidence, which he sorely needed. And then you go out and let him kick a 52-yarder into the wind, which he almost made right after a 5-yard penalty from the offensive line that pushed him back 5 yards. So I'm not down on him at all. And I think this is the perfect game based on the game plan, based on who they're playing, that he could get a lot of those mid-range opportunities from 25 to 40 yards. And I think there should be full confidence that he can make them.
Yeah, I think when you look at this Wisconsin defense, because they're a little bit more limited athletically on the back end and they play with so few guys up front, like your strategy in the red zone, you got to pound that rock. Yeah. Don't try to get cute. Really, one of the best things I was watching was a documentary about the Dallas Cowboys when they won 3 Super Bowls in 4 years. And they said, well, what do you attribute that to? What do you think set you apart from other teams, basically, other than that they're talented, good coach, whatever, Hall of Fame players. But they said, we could run the ball in the red zone better than anybody. And part of that was on their running back, Emmitt Smith, because you need good vision. You got to have good feel for the game, which Kyle Monangai does. And they're like, we didn't try to get too fancy when we got near the goal line. And then I think Rutgers needs to do that same thing. And if you get stopped, especially if you're in the middle, and then you just set up a fairly easy kick from straight away, that will build confidence, put points on the board, especially at home. Like, that's got to be the tactic here. I know you're tempted to go to your Ian Strong corner of the end zone type of thing. I know it's tempting. And I do think that a healthy Ian Strong, this is a defensive backfield he can exploit. But that's not what your team is. That's not your identity. So if you can sprinkle one of those in, but then run the ball. The other thing that we didn't mention, when Rutgers had to go for the 4th and 1 late in the game against Nebraska and they went tush push, they destroyed them. They shoved them so far back on that you said to yourself, if you could have, and I know I don't love the tush push, but if you would have done that with all the momentum after that punt block on 1st or 2nd down, fine. On 3rd, okay, maybe we want to start changing it. And I do think Monangai got in on the 1st down play. Don't get me wrong. I know that's been litigated to death. But, like, Rutgers has, even if you don't want to say they have elite offensive linemen on the starting unit for that, dude, if Taj White and Dante Chin or whoever else you're bringing in, maybe it's going to be Dom Rivera now, are like your linemen in the back that are getting that 2nd level push, like, that's pretty good. Like, there's no way that Wisconsin with their defensive line is going to be able to stop that 3 plays, let's say, that you need 1.5 yards or less. Like, there's no way they can stop that, right? And so, yeah, maybe you get stuffed once, but Rutgers, you saw it against Nebraska. If you wear them down a little bit late in that quarter, they could just plow them over. And I do think they've been in the run a little early for that reason. So this week, same type of thing. Like I said, I think this is a get right home, stick it to your identity type of game. And the way that Wisconsin plays, there's only so many things they can do to kind of game plan for that identity based on how their team is set up.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this the last few weeks. It's like the odds of Wisconsin blowing out Rutgers is less likely than Rutgers winning by multiple scores, I think, based on the strengths of the teams. And to your point, I'm actually the opposite on the goal line. I think, like, I'm completely fine with if Rutgers is 1st and goal if they run it 4 times. And if you can't get in on 4 runs, fine. But at least I can sleep better at night than the 2 pass plays that they ran on 3rd and 4th, which I thought were just poorly designed or bad. One was bad design, one was bad read. But at any rate, just in terms of the tush push you talked about, but also with Monangai, like you have to live and die with your strength. And if your strength isn't good enough, then it's not good enough. But when you don't use your strength in those situations, I just think it's maddening. So that's a great call about how they did the tush push late in the game. I didn't mention that yet. So I think, in this game, to your point before, just stick to what works, control the clock. I really do think the defense can force some mistakes from Wisconsin and get some turnovers, get some short fields. And that's when Rutgers has to run it down their throats as well. And this is a game that I think could be a vintage Monangai 150-plus yard game. Also, last thing, they need to work Sam Brown in too. He did not get nearly enough action. It wasn't just about abandoning the run against Nebraska. They never gave Brown really a chance to be a factor in that game, and I think that's a mistake. I think he's got to be some part of the game plan moving forward on a consistent basis.
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting to see, again, this game, like I mentioned, with Wisconsin kind of straight line speeding. Do you try to throw that ball to Sam Brown or Monangai on like a quick pass? Like we saw that play work so well on that. It was like a 3rd and long, and Monangai got like 14 out of 15 yards or something like that.
Yeah.
Part of it was novelty that wasn't really on film, but I still think that might work, even if they know that could be the play call. And so the other thing, like you said, I mean, Sam Brown, right? When does Sam Brown struggle? He struggles when you try to ask him to make too many reads and they have a lot of guys up front on the line that are tough. But if they are light in the box and he has a chance to go against a linebacker, he's going to be almost as big and fast as the linebackers that he's going against. And so this is another game for him where, again, attacking behind the tackle, that's one of those type of runs that he and Monangai are both skilled at. I don't think this is a game where you want, and we haven't seen a lot of them this year, but this isn't the Deshaun Benjamin quick handoff, run up the gut type. This is the plow them, blocks develop play, like try to use their momentum against them. Yeah. I mean, what Alabama did was the same thing Rutgers did against Virginia Tech. They let these guys just run in full speed, and the offensive lineman just kind of like directed them to the side. And then Alabama was having success either with their quarterback or their running back, just being like, okay, these guys run right past you and then just run right forward. And Virginia Tech was doing a lot of the same thing against Rutgers until they realized we're getting destroyed and we need to not overcommit there. But then that had them on their heels, and Rutgers was able to run the ball that way. And so I think that's the same type of thing. Brown and Monangai both can do that. If your linemen just like let them run full speed and you kind of redirect their energy, you're going to get plays up the middle. And so, yeah, I agree that this is really a two-headed monster type of game. And again, I think if Rutgers plays average, they're normal, and Wisconsin plays their normal, Rutgers should win this game.
Yep.
If Wisconsin plays really well and Rutgers doesn't, fine, they're going to win. If Rutgers plays really well and Wisconsin doesn't, they'll win by multiple scores. I think that all things being equal, especially on your home field, I think Rutgers is rightfully favored. In fact, I probably would have thought the line should probably be more like 3.5 or 4. But I also see that Wisconsin may have flipped a switch last week in the second half against Purdue, because Braden Locke, I mean, you look at this poor guy. Last year, he had to come in to face Iowa and Ohio State. And then this year, his first game playing was against Alabama. Like, you can't get any tougher than that in terms of, what you're thrust into. He's a big-time high school quarterback from Texas, if I remember right. So he's played a lot of big-time football. I mean, big-time football for a long time. So he's not going to be scared of the moment, but it doesn't mean you can't just take advantage of him. And offensively, the same thing. Like, take advantage of the Wisconsin limitations, and you should win this game.
Yeah, and it's also fascinating from an emotional mindset standpoint. Just with, Wisconsin riding high off of that big win. Obviously Purdue worse in the Big Ten, but, blew them out, had the most success they've had, got a lot of guys in the mix. And then Rutgers coming back after a really tough loss. That's where the leadership of this team is going to be so key. Shiano talked about, don't let Nebraska beat you twice.
Right.
It's a noon kickoff. The crowd, I think it'll be a good crowd. I don't think it's going to be a sellout with Yom Kippur. But they're going to have to find their own emotional lift. And that's where, that energy on the sideline, the leadership in the huddles, Powell, Calais McManus, really drawing energy for this team is going to be critical. And it really is at the point where your developmental program, your stage is set. Like you should be ahead of Wisconsin at this stage with them in year 2 of Luke Fickell and their roster, and where Rutgers is. This is a game I just think you have to win for so many reasons, just long-term perspective, recruiting, but also obviously for the ceiling for this season. Because if you lose this game, I think 8-4 becomes your best case scenario. Again, wouldn't complain if we're 8-4. But there's still a chance to have a special season, and winning this game is crucial to doing so.
What I wanted to say about that was kind of talked about this offline. Big Ten's basically got Penn State, Ohio State, Oregon, who are clearly the top 3 teams. There's no doubt about that. And then you have 2, maybe 3 teams at the bottom: Purdue, UCLA, who we get next week, and Northwestern's probably in that 16 spot.
Yeah.
Everybody else could be anybody else in any given week. So there's no guarantee that this is a win. But the teams that are left standing at the end are going to be the ones that did win the majority of these games against roughly equally matched teams. And so, again, I think I predicted a loss preseason because Rutgers just had not beaten Wisconsin. But Wisconsin has not played as well as we thought they probably could have preseason. And so, yeah, I mean, just if they lose, it's not a reason to hit the panic button, but you are, to your point, there's just less toss-up games on the schedule to win after this one. So This is one you really, I mean, if we look at FPI, I think this is Rutgers' 2nd or 3rd best percentage chance to win by ESPN FPI, which I think is not perfect, but it's a good indicator that 60% should be a Rutgers win. Not 100, not 90, 60. So if they lose, it's not the end of the world, but they should win.
Totally agree. Momentum is important. Getting back on winning track with a winnable game next week before you head to USC and then have that bye, certainly crucial. A lot of ground we covered. As always, thank you so much for your great analysis, David. And we'll be back next week. We'll try to do 2 episodes next week. We'll do a mid-season recap review as well as break down the UCLA game. And then I'll be back after the Wisconsin game on Saturday with a rapid reaction. I also have a pod out with Kedrick Stumbris of Athlon Sports and the Scotty Six-Pack, giving some insight on Wisconsin and their season so far. Thanks so much for listening and watching once again here at the Scarlet Faithful podcast.